When most people think of the Renaissance, they think of Italy. A sun-kissed realm of popes, piazzas and palazzos. A place filled with hugely talented artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo. A generation who, in the 15th century, left the Middle Ages behind and created a glorious new kind of art. More inventive and more exuberant than anything seen before. When most people think of the Renaissance, they don't think of Britain. While the Italians were busy building a modern world, the British were still stuck in the medieval mud. The Renaissance is supposed to have passed us by. But that isn't true. The British did have a Renaissance, and it was bold, it was beautiful, and it was utterly brilliant. Yet for some reason, we've all but forgotten it. In this series, I want to rediscover our forgotten Renaissance, a dazzling movement that flourished from around 1500 to the Civil War 150 years later. That gave us our first great paintings, our first stately homes, our earliest scientific breakthroughs, and perhaps the finest writer of them all. A movement that catapulted us out of the Middle Ages and laid the foundations of a modern British culture that still shapes us today. This series isn't about kings and queens or Tudors and Stuarts. It's about the painters, sculptors, poets, playwrights, composers, inventors, explorers and craftsmen who together revolutionised the way we saw the world. And this episode is about how it all got started. How a handful of brilliant European artists brought the new ideas of the Renaissance to Britain. How we learned from their techniques, experimented with their ideas, and through them began to develop a voice of our own. Okay, so the story of the British Renaissance doesn't actually start in Britain. It begins in Florence, when an Italian sculptor accidentally kickstarts our own artistic revolution. Pietro Torrigiano was proud, arrogant, and extremely competitive. He was childhood friends with Michelangelo, but rather than admiring the great man like everyone else, he was pathologically jealous of him. Things came to a head one day when both men were in a chapel studying some frescoes. So they were next to each other, sketching, when Michelangelo apparently made some snide remark. And that's when it happened. That's when years of jealousy bubbled over. That's when Torrigiano snapped. Clenching my fist, I gave him such a punch that I felt the bone and cartilage in his nose crumble like a biscuit. He will remain marked by me as long as he lives. Torrigiano permanently disfigured Florence's favourite son. He was left with only one option: to flee the city and take his talent elsewhere. Sometime in about 1507, Torrigiano fetched up in what was reported to be Europe's most Philistine backwater, a grubby, dirty, uninspiring little place at the end of the known world. England. When Torrigiano first arrived in England, it must have felt like it stepped back into the past. The Renaissance had been raging in Italy for almost 200 years, but here there was absolutely no sign of it whatsoever. After 150 years of bloody wars and infighting, the British hadn't had time for a Renaissance. They hadn't even had time for art. In Britain, artists weren't celebrities like they were in Italy. They were anonymous workmen, paid the same as plasterers and ironmongers. And as for art, well, the British didn't really know what art was. They didn't even have a word for painting. If a painting was on canvas, it was called a cloth, and if it was on panel, it was called a table. But Torrigiano wasn't without work for long. In 1512, the young King Henry VIII, who fancied himself as a patron of new ideas, gave this exotic Italian artist a very special commission. Torrigiano was offered a staggering £1,500, that's more than £1 million in today's money, to make and work well, cleanly, surely, workmanly, curiously and substantially, those are the words in the contract, a very special artwork. It would be his masterpiece, and it would be unlike anything the British had ever seen. Torrigiano's piece was commissioned for Westminster Abbey, a place that pretty much summed up where England was artistically, still stuck in the Middle Ages. With its stylized saints and pointed Gothic arches, it was thoroughly medieval. But what Torrigiano came up with was emphatically different. In a quiet chapel at the back of the abbey, inside an ornate chamber, is the tomb of King Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth of York. Their life-size effigies rest on an imposing tomb chest that's decorated with biblical figures and saints. It's a revolutionary piece of work, and I think it's revolutionary for two reasons. First, Torrigiano did it all. He conceived it, he designed it, he modelled the figures, he cast the bronze, he carved the stone, he gilded the surfaces. He did absolutely everything. And if that doesn't seem particularly unusual today, in his time it was unheard of. In Britain, most tombs, indeed most artworks, were made by anonymous artisans. But Torrigiano was no medieval craftsman. He was a Renaissance artist. The second revolutionary thing about this tomb is its style. It is Renaissance through and through. It's made from white marble and gilt bronze, the materials that Donatello and Michelangelo would have used. It's adorned with columns and acanthus leaves that hark back to the classical ruins of Italy. The figures of the king and his wife are lifelike, their hands bulging with veins and dimples. But for me, the most Renaissance thing of all about this tomb are these cheeky little chappies. They're called putti, and they're Italian cherubs. And they were 2 a penny in Italian Renaissance paintings, but they were completely new in this country. All in all, it's like a little piece of the Renaissance has been beamed down into the Middle Ages. Isn't it? Torrigiano's tomb marked a turning point in British art. It brought a modern style to a medieval country, It proved that artists were much more than mere craftsmen, and it showed that art itself could finally take centre stage in British life. Our Renaissance had begun. In the few years since Torrigiano had come and gone, England had begun to change dramatically. Under Henry VIII, it was peaceful for the first time in decades, and its economy was booming. It was now a land of opportunity, and it wasn't long before the finest minds of the Renaissance came knocking. Artists poured into Britain from all over Europe. But none of them would have a greater impact than the brilliant Swiss-German painter Hans Holbein. Hans Holbein arrived in England in the autumn of 1526. He was just 29 years old. He came with no friends and family, he didn't speak a word of the language, and he had virtually no money. But Holbein had big ambitions. Holbein had made his reputation as a portrait painter in the Swiss city of Basel, a place that was now being torn apart by the struggles of the Protestant Reformation. He would be the first artist to bring the new techniques and ideas of the Renaissance portrait to Britain, a place where portrait painting was almost non-existent. Holbein would look closer and harder at British faces than anyone had done before him. He would capture their idiosyncrasies and their imperfections, and in doing so, he would make us think differently about each other and ourselves. Holbein's genius is best seen not in his finished works, but in intimate pictures that he hoped few would ever see. Today, they're housed at Windsor, in the Royal Collection. These are some of Holbein's preparatory drawings for his portraits, and these really are some of the most breathtaking artworks I've ever seen. They were made 500 years ago, and yet these people look like the people you see on the streets today. In fact, these are portraits of a new class of people, merchants and scholars and courtiers, the people who had taken over from the church as the new patrons of art. This is Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, when he was about 15 years old, and it is alarming how present he feels. He stares right out at us, right through us, and it almost feels that if you look at him long enough, you'll see him blink, and if you lean in close enough, you'll smell his breath. Howard was executed, beheaded, a few years after this portrait was made, yet on this piece of paper, he'll always be alive. This is the courtier Sir Richard Southwell. He was a famously unpleasant man, and I don't think Holbein liked him either. He looks pompous and humourless. His nose is flared with self-regard, and Holbein has made sure to include some scars under his throat that he got from an infection of the lymph nodes. But the best bit is this little line in German, a note from Holbein to himself that translates as, "The eyes rather yellow." And Holbein's women are just as fascinating. Beautiful, ethereal, and so elegantly anxious. You know, one of the most impressive things about these drawings is the technique. It is so economical. A simple outline of pen and ink, a tiny touch of blue chalk for the eyes, a tiny stroke of pink chalk for the lips, and Holbein lets the paper do the rest. And it's that delicacy that enables him to capture the fragile, the fleeting, the transient quality of life itself. Holbein's drawings are the first really lifelike faces in the whole of British history, and they mark the beginning of a major British tradition, a warts-and-all preference for reality over beauty that has persisted ever since. But I think they're even more important than that.
Holbein's portraits contain the seeds of a new idea. They mark, I think, a moment when people stopped thinking about themselves simply as types, as kings, as knights, as courtiers, and started thinking about themselves as individuals, with their own unique characteristics, their own unique hopes and fears. And that birth of the individual is a defining feature of the Renaissance.
But the Renaissance wasn't only about looking differently at each other, it was also about looking differently at the world itself. And Holbein captured this radical worldview in his most famous painting, one of the great paintings of the Renaissance: The Ambassadors.
And here are the ambassadors themselves, Jean de Dinteville and Georges de Selve, looking proud of their achievements and even prouder of their clothes. But the first thing you notice about this painting, the most mysterious thing, the most famous thing, are not the ambassadors, but this splodge. If you look at it from this angle, you'll see it's actually a distorted but anatomically accurate skull. And it's a reminder that even rich and powerful men like these two will die like everyone else. But I don't think this picture is really about the ambassadors. I think it's about what's right at the very centre. This cryptic array of objects. On the top shelf, these objects relate to the heavens. A celestial globe, 2 quadrants, a sundial. On the shelf below, these objects relate to the earthly realm. A terrestrial globe, a book of arithmetic, some musical instruments, and a book of hymns that's painted in so much detail I could actually sing them. These 2 shelves depict no less than the entire cosmos, heaven and earth together. Holbein has created an image of a world in which everything can be charted, measured, quantified, understood. A world that mankind finally has mastery over. This is Holbein's most ambitious portrait. It is a portrait of the Renaissance itself.
As Holbein assembled his Renaissance stage set, he would have looked to his best friend for the props. A German mathematician and astronomer called Nicholas Kratzer. Kratzer represented the other crucial aspect of the Renaissance, the spirit of scientific inquiry. Kratzer arrived in England in about 1518. But his reasons for coming remain a mystery.
When one friend heard of his visit, he advised Kratzer to keep his things secret and tell no one who summoned him. He's to invent an excuse as far from the truth as possible.
We may never know Kratzer's true motives. He may have been on a secret mission. He may have been a spy. But we do know that he was immediately employed by the king himself as the royal clockmaker. Spy or not, when Kratzer came to London, he certainly brought secrets with him. This is his private notebook, and it contains diagrams, equations, and instructions for the instruments he made.
It's so exciting to be looking through this book, because looking through it is like peering into Nicholas Kratzer's mind. And it was clearly a formidable mind.
It was also a genuinely Renaissance mind, a mind that believed in observation and calculation, a mind that believed the secrets of the universe could be unlocked with precision engineering. And for Kratzer and his peers, nothing was quite as precise as a sundial. An instrument that harnessed the sun itself, transforming its rays into the hands of a mathematically designed clock. Joanna Migdal is one of the few people to continue the great art of dialing.
As an instrument maker yourself, how do you rate Kratzer?
Well, what was extraordinary about Kratzer was he brought the knowledge from Europe to this country. The 50 years that were after Kratzer, the dials became amazing. And so whatever he did, he just sort of changed the consciousness of understanding of sundials.
So he really kick-started things in this country?
Yes, I think he really did. I mean, I don't think Henry VIII would have brought him over unless he had something special about him.
So do we know much, Joanna, about Kratzer as a person?
One of the sundials, there's a quotation on it, I think in Oxford, where he proudly says that he and his stonemason could drink in the German style, which basically meant that they could drink anyone under the table. So he was obviously a fun-loving man too.
Kratzer evidently could handle his drink because he specialised in miniature sundials, and these required a clear head and a steady hand to make. Miraculously, one of them still survives.
This is a delightful little sundial, handmade out of gilt brass. But it doesn't just have one dial, it has 9 of them. 7 along the edge and 1 on each side.
Each one of them is perfectly calibrated. All are set to a latitude of 51.5 degrees north of the equator, and that means it was designed to work in London.
So to use it, the first thing you need to do is to orient these gnomons towards the north. And right at the top of it, there's a little hole, and inside that hole there would have been a compass, and that compass would have helped you position it exactly right. And when the positioning is right, the sun, and I'm going to use a torch because we're indoors, the sun would pass over the surface of the sundials and would help you tell the time. And the really clever thing is that actually not just one of these sundials will tell the time, but all of them. And this was completely new in Britain. There had been sundials before, there had been pocket sundials before, but nothing as showy, as complex, as sophisticated as this. And most remarkable of all, we know for whom this object was made. Right here on the stand is a little picture of a dinky cardinal's hat, and that tells us that this sundial was made for Cardinal Wolsey, King Henry's chief minister. And you know, I can just imagine the chubby figure of Wolsey pulling this out after dinner, passing it around the table and showing off his fiendishly clever gadget.
Foreign technology was becoming fashionable, reflecting an appetite for scientific knowledge, an excitement that was not confined to England. Thanks to Scotland's long-running alliance with France, the Scottish Stuart kings had embraced the Renaissance with enthusiasm. Their base was Stirling Castle, part of which they restyled according to the latest fashion. They filled it with modish sculptures of European monarchs, classical heroes, and lots of Italian putty. And they invited musicians, scholars, and scientists from all over Europe to come and work there. One of the most eccentric was a young Italian called Giovanni Damiano, or, as the Scots called him, John Damien.
John Damien, was an alchemist, and he divided opinion dramatically. Some people thought he was a charlatan, and they accused him of murdering a priest in Italy and impersonating a doctor in France. But the king thought he was a genius.
Damien was a contemporary of Leonardo, and both were obsessed with the ultimate Renaissance ambition: human flight. In fact, Leonardo's famous drawings of flying machines may well have inspired Damien to embark on his most audacious experiment. It was the morning of the 27th of September, 1507. The king had just dispatched 2 ambassadors to France, but as they exited, Damien entered.
John Damien assembled the court and made a staggering announcement. He would beat the ambassadors to Paris. He then strapped on 2 large wings which he'd fashioned from hen feathers. He stepped up onto those ramparts over there, and when he had everyone's attention, he leapt off.
In the end, Damien didn't quite make it to France. Instead, he landed in a dunghill near the foot of the castle and broke his leg.
John Damien's flight could be seen as a miserable failure, but I disagree. These ramparts are really, really high, and for him to jump off them and only break his leg, well, I think he must have flown at least for a bit, which would make this one of the first human flights in British history.
John Damien's grand ambitions pleased the king, but many others at court mocked and insulted him relentlessly. And in doing so, they revealed a broader tension at the heart of the British Renaissance.
The British Renaissance had started brilliantly, but as I'm sure you've noticed, it had not been very British. Its greatest sculptor had been Italian, its greatest painter had come from Switzerland, and its greatest inventor had been German. And this was not lost on the natives.
For some time, Londoners had been concerned that foreigners were stealing their jobs. In 1517, this resentment had bubbled over into outright violence.
It was about 9 o'clock in the evening when 1,000 angry English apprentices gathered in the city of London. They broke into Newgate Prison, liberated several prisoners who'd already been arrested for race crimes, and then marched through the streets, looting foreign craftsmen's workshops and assaulting anyone who got in their way.
By 3 a.m, the riots had been quelled, but the problem would not go away. British artists and craftsmen soon realised that they would have to move with the times. From the 1520s, a new generation began to discover Renaissance ideas for themselves. But they wouldn't simply copy Europe. They would do things differently.
On the continent, the Renaissance had typically been elegant and refined. The British, however, were not a particularly elegant and refined bunch. So when we did the Renaissance, it was earthy, visceral, and at first a bit rough around the edges.
The first of these native pioneers was a young English courtier called Thomas Wyatt, captured here by none other than Hans Holbein.
Thomas Wyatt was a playboy, assassin, spy, diplomat. He's famous for having had a secret affair with Anne Boleyn. But the real reason we should remember him is this. He was, in my opinion, the man who brought the Renaissance to English literature.
Before Wyatt, English poetry was stuck in a rut. In the 120 years since Chaucer, there hadn't been one original voice, and poets seemed content to translate French romances into bad English verse. But Wyatt would turn his back on archaic fairy tales and make poetry one of Britain's most dynamic art forms. And it all started with a chance encounter.
It was New Year 1527. Thomas Wyatt was 24 years old. He was on the banks of the Thames when he saw a man preparing a boat for travel. Wyatt asked the man where he was going, and the man said, "To Italy, for the king." Wyatt absorbed this information and then asked if he could join him.
The trip would inspire Wyatt, but it would also nearly cost him his life. The two men arrived in Italy in February on a diplomatic mission to meet the Pope. But Italy was a lot more dangerous than Wyatt had bargained for. While travelling alone to deliver a letter, Wyatt was kidnapped by mercenaries, held for ransom, and finally released.
Now, at this point, most people would have run home with their tails between their legs, but not Thomas Wyatt, because Wyatt was in love.
While travelling around, Wyatt had seen the Italian Renaissance with his own eyes for the first time, and he loved everything about it. But nothing appealed to him quite like its poetry. And most of all, the love lyrics of Petrarch.
Petrarch was a towering figure of the Italian Renaissance. In fact, many people think he actually invented the idea of the Renaissance, but he was also a hopeless romantic.
Petrarch was a pioneer of the sonnet, a short poem made up of one verse and 14 lines.
Petrarch pretty much reinvented the sonnet as the perfect love poem, one that could express the true complexity of emotion in an extremely condensed form. His first 8 lines, they would set up the problem, which was usually a burning desire for an unattainable woman. And the last 6 lines, well, they would resolve that desire. It was short, it was sweet, and it was passionate, and Thomas Wyatt was smitten.
In May 1527, Wyatt returned to London wanting to breathe new life into English poetry. Wyatt took the Italian sonnet and put it to bold new use. He wrote tortured love poems for his friends in the Tudor court. They were very private, often intimate.
Wyatt's poems were written by hand onto small, precious pieces of paper. They were folded, rolled up, wrapped in ribbon, and then furtively passed from person to person, tucked into a pocket or left under a pillow for a lucky lady to find.
Unlike Petrarch's spiritual love poems, Wyatt's were more passionate, more pained, and more human. This is a copy of one of his finest.
They flee from me that sometime did me seek, with naked foot stalking in my chamber. I have seen them gentle, tame and meek, that now are wild and do not remember. What an explosive start to a poem. They flee from me that sometime did me seek. It's so simple, yet so powerful. It's about loss, it's about rejection, it's about heartbreak. And who ultimately hasn't felt those things in their life? And that ultimately is the most amazing thing about this poem. Thomas Wyatt wrote it 500 years ago, and you can still feel his pain today.
Wyatt repeatedly explored the pain of rejection.
I find no peace, and all my war is done. I fear and hope, I burn and freeze like ice.
I fly above the wind, yet can I not arise, and naught I have, and all the world I seize on.
I desire to perish, and yet I ask health. I love another, and thus I hate myself.
I love another, and thus I hate myself. That is a great line.
It's a great line.
How good a poet was he?
I think he was a genius. I think that if you spend some time with Wyatt's poetry, the more you look at it, the more impressive it is. He produced a poetry which is much more human than Petrarchan poetry. He produced a poem which actually addresses our own human feelings of frustration, entitlement,
Rejection.
bewilderment, rejection, abandonment. You know, there isn't anybody who could read a Wyatt's poem and not feel, yes, I have been there, I have been there.
Wyatt also didn't shy away from writing about sex.
When her loose gown from her shoulders did fall, and she me caught in her arms long and small,
Therewithal sweetly did me kiss, and softly said, Dear
Dear
heart,
heart,
how like you this?
it was no dream. I lay broad waking. But nobody in medieval poetry went to bed with anybody, only in dreams. That's why this is such a radical poem.
There is a real Englishness to his poetry, isn't there?
I think he is, above all, an English poet. Unlike most of the other architects of the Renaissance, he was English. Torrigiano was Italian, Holbein was German, so he had a conscious desire to write in English and make English a language which was as flexible and as beautiful and a vehicle for the expression of complex ideas as Latin or as Greek or as Italian had been.
Thomas Wyatt died when he was only 39, but his influence on English literature was profound. He'd taken a refined foreign art form and made it unmistakably English, less concerned with elegance than with capturing the messy quality of life as lived, setting the tone for English poets from Shakespeare to Philip Larkin. If Thomas Wyatt introduced an unglamorous realism to poetry, another Englishman was to do the same with painting. His name was John Betts.
Like so many British artists of this period, virtually nothing is known about John Betts, but it seems he was trained by none other than Hans Holbein. Now, if that's true, it makes him a crucial figure, the first Renaissance-trained British artist in history.
Only a handful of his portraits survive. One of them, of an unknown man, is the earliest British picture in the Tate collection.
And this is it. It was painted in 1545, just 2 years after Holbein died. Now, I'll be honest, it's not as good as Holbein, but it's pretty darn good. And it's got that defining Renaissance feature, the desire to be realistic. John Betts has individually painted every single curling hair in this man's ginger beard. He's used wet paint to capture the ruffle of the fur collar. And the face, well, for maybe the first time in British art, it's lifelike. This picture is the beginning of a homegrown Renaissance in painting. But it suggests that our Renaissance would not be about beauty, grace, and endless cherubs. It would instead have a solid and earthy reality.
But just as British painting was finally about to flourish, the country descended into darkness. After the death of Henry VIII, the long-standing tensions between the old Catholic Church and the new Protestant faith erupted into violence. In the 1550s, over 300 innocent men and women were cruelly and publicly burnt alive. Their crime? Being Protestant during the reign of a Catholic monarch. The new medium used to document these atrocities was the printed book. And the man who made it happen was an evangelical London printer called John Day. A man who would arguably have a greater impact on the culture of this country than anyone of his generation. John Day was nearly murdered himself. He was a passionate Protestant, and during the reign of Catholic Mary Tudor, he was arrested for publicising the Protestant cause.
But he was one of the lucky ones. Day watched in horror as hundreds of other Protestants were burnt at the stake, and he became determined to avenge their deaths.
When Mary died, Day got his chance.
In the autumn of 1559, John Day was approached by a writer called John Foxe. Foxe was a man on a mission. For some time he'd been working on a book about the many Protestant martyrs. It would be a witness to what he believed was an English genocide.
John Day immediately agreed to print the book at whatever cost, and crucially, he insisted that it be illustrated with nothing censored. It's since become known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, and it's a milestone in the history of bookmaking.
1,800 pages, 1.9 million words. The Book of Martyrs was the longest book in British history and more than twice as long as the Bible. However, I think its real genius was not John Foxe's text, but John Day's illustrations.
They depict the suffering of Protestants, and they are vivid and gruesome. Burnings, torture, disembowelment. Foxe and Day used the shock tactics of modern photojournalism. But they weren't out merely to shock. They wanted to expose the truth. As in the sensational case of a supposed suicide.
Richard Hunn was imprisoned after a minor disagreement with a priest. A few days after his incarceration, he was being brought some food in his cell when he was found dead, hanging from his own belt. The authorities thought it was a straightforward suicide, but Foxe and Day did their homework. They even read the coroner's report, and they thought otherwise. The report said that a fresh candle had been found snuffed out in the dead man's cell. Now, why would Richard Hunn have done that? Why would he have extinguished his candle before he tied that noose and hanged himself? For Day and Foxe, that candle was a clinching piece of evidence. Someone else must have done it. Someone who wanted to cover their tracks. Foxe and Day were convinced that these three men had been sent by the Catholic Church to murder Richard Hunn and then make it look like suicide.
The Book of Martyrs had more impact than Day could ever have imagined. It was distributed to churches, schools, and even pubs, and it became the most widely read book in England for the next 200 years.
This book had a profound effect on the English people. It helped forge the identity of England as a Protestant nation. And John Day's images were crucial to its success. They ensured that all British people, literate and illiterate alike, could understand Fox's message.
The Book of Martyrs is a monumental work of the Renaissance, but it is also the beginning of a distinctly British tradition. A tradition of graphically exposing injustice that runs all the way through our culture, from William Hogarth to Gerald Scarfe. By the middle of the century, British artists and writers had not just absorbed the newest ideas from abroad, they had brilliantly adapted them to their own tastes. Thomas Wyatt had turned the Italian sonnet into the classic form of English poetry. John Betts had combined Holbein's impeccable technique with an uncompromising realism. And John Day had used a Renaissance invention to teach the English people about their own history. In spite of the dark times they'd lived through, they had proved a match for their continental counterparts. But that wasn't enough. Now, with the new Queen Elizabeth on the throne and the country more at ease with itself, British artists wanted to produce work that was better than anything in Europe. And that competitive spirit would lead to one of the greatest pieces of music ever written.
According to one anecdote, sometime in the 1500s, an Italian song arrived in England for 30 different voices. On hearing it, one great duke challenged the composers of England to do the same. Eventually, one English composer came back with a song not for 30 voices, but for 40 voices.
His name was Thomas Tallis. He was an organist and singer for the royal court, who, over the course of a long life, composed music for virtually the entire Tudor dynasty.
Thomas Tallis's greatest work was the one he produced as a result of that challenge, a motet for 40 voices called Spem in Alium.
Tallis was used to composing for 4, 5 or 6 voices. Composing 40 different melodies, all to be sung at the same time, was a huge leap. But the result, Spem in Alium, is one of the richest and most ambitious pieces of choral music in the English canon. It's so beautiful, I'm not going to ruin it by talking. David Hurley has sung Spem in Alium many times.
So David, what is it actually like to perform Spem in Alium?
It's quite terrifying, actually. I mean, you either are the person that comes in first, which in itself is terrifying, or you're in choir 6 or 7 and you have to wait around for ages for the and work out exactly when it is you're meant to come in.
When all those voices come in at that point of the music, is it really, it must be, euphoric experience. It must be wonderful.
It's an incredible sound. I mean, both for the people listening and actually for the people involved. It's just this wall of sound. An ancient Renaissance version of surround sound before its time.
So was that a broader, feel of the time, that the English were competing with what was coming from the continent?
Yes, I think we had a little bit of an inferiority complex, and their way of dealing with it was to make England this incredibly important place artistically. English music is very much an important part of showing how wonderful England was.
In rising to the Italian challenge, Tallis had created a work that was as sophisticated as anything on the continent, but at the same time distinctly English. A breathtaking feat of virtuosity that was a sign of the country's growing confidence. By the 1560s, the British Renaissance had serious momentum. And yet, if you walked through any town, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were still in the Middle Ages, because our buildings were still resolutely medieval. That finally began to change when a few builders started to dabble in the new classical style of the European Renaissance. And they got their ideas from architectural pattern books from France and Italy.
When it comes to classical architecture, there is pretty much everything here you could ever want. So what have we got? We have Doric columns, like those used on the Parthenon. We have Ionic columns, and you can always tell an Ionic column because it has these little curls on the top. And we have Corinthian columns with their acanthus leaf capitals.
There are also pediments, domes, temple fronts, and triumphal arches like those built by the Roman emperors. But it took one determined, even obsessive Englishman to bring all these ideas together and to create something that was both utterly unique and unmistakably British. His name was John Thynne. John Thynne was born in 1515. He was the son of a Midlands farmer, but he had grand designs. He married the Lord Mayor of London's daughter, and with his wife's fortune bought a former priory in Wiltshire and proceeded to turn it into his family's seat.
John Thynne was frankly pretty unpleasant. He was famously impatient and had a ferocious temper, but he was also ambitious and single-minded. And when he set his mind on something, he never gave up.
He wanted a house to suit his ego. It had to be new, it had to be modern, and for John Thynne, that meant it had to be classical. Thynne was so determined to get his house just right that he wrote letters to his builders every single day.
I would you do not forget to mend the lanes with gravel in such places as need or require. Also, let there be haste made with the top of my tower. Further, I would you not forget to get planks sawn for my doors. Every single detail of his house he's writing about. Must have been a nightmare employer.
But John Thynne's obsessive attention to detail eventually paid off. In 1568, after 30 years of building and rebuilding again, he finished his house. It's still standing today. It is called Longleat. And it's the first of England's great stately homes. Longleat is completely unlike the fortified manor houses of its time. It's symmetrical and it's smothered in classical features. But it's also unlike any classical building in Europe. It doesn't slavishly follow the architectural pattern books, it mixes everything up, creating an eclectic, exuberant and rule-breaking English style. Finn loved to take his guests behind the scenes of his lavish home. For he had a surprise to show them.
After dinner, John Finn would lead his guests up this staircase. They can't have had a clue where he was taking them.
But it was worth the climb.
This is the roof at Longleat. And when John Finn's guests came up here, they must have been completely overwhelmed. It must have been like nothing they'd ever seen before, because it's filled with columns and statues and domes, and John Finn's land stretches out for as far as the eye can see. It's utterly amazing. And back then, it must have felt like the entire Renaissance had been assembled and then set down on top of one house. But John Finn had another trick up his sleeve.
He would present his guests with a very special work of art. Exquisitely designed sculptures, some of them covered in gold. They were phenomenally fashionable and phenomenally expensive.
These are sugar sculptures, and they would have appeared at any self-respecting Renaissance banquet. And they are exquisite little things. And the best thing of all is everything here is edible, even the plates.
But that was just the icing on the cake. Longleat itself is a seminal masterpiece, impossible without foreign inspiration, yet, like so much in our Renaissance, quintessentially British. It was 60 years since Pietro Torrigiano had stepped foot on English soil. But Britain was no longer a cultural backwater. It was on the verge of becoming a cultural superpower. And this was only the beginning. Next time, as the nation's confidence grows, its artists turn away from Europe completely. They fill their paintings with secret signs and their buildings with riddles. And finally, they set sail, taking their Renaissance to the New World.